Review Fourier series. So the general idea of Fourier series is that if you have a signal, let's call it x of t, that is periodic with period t naught, that we can write that x of t as a sum of complex exponentials. So I'll write this as k is equal to minus infinity to infinity, bunch of complex exponentials weighted by these complex Fourier series coefficients ak. So write this as e to the j k omega naught t, where the omega naught is the fundamental frequency of this wave in terms of radians per second. Or it could be radians per year or whatever your time unit happens to be that you're using. So we'll quite often write this in several other ways. One way is just to write this omega naught as 2 pi f naught. So here I have a fundamental frequency that's in hertz. Quite often we'll also write this also as 2 pi over t naught, the actual fundamental period. And when you're actually computing these AKs, if you're having doing something complicated, this is usually at some point the most convenient form to use because it winds up with canceling with some other t naught somewhere. Now, this sum here is not necessarily always infinite. You can have cases where most of the AKs are 0. And in general, finding these AKs can in general be pretty tricky. But there are cases where you can sort of get the AKs directly without doing a whole lot of work if the signal is already written as just a finite bunch of cosines. So here's an example of that. Let's say x of t is equal to 4 cosine 10 pi, and then I'll say, how about plus 2 sine 15 pi t. So a couple things to note about this. One of them is that if I try to figure out what the fundamental frequency is here, it's not actually present in the signal. So my fundamental frequency here, there should be a t here, sorry, is 5 pi. So this is 2 times that, this is 3 times that. These are integer multiples of this 5 pi, but it's not actually present in the original signal. And that does have some interesting consequences for audio, in that quite often your brain will try to substitute sort of signals that it expects to have there. So if you are building say a pipe organ, you might build pipes to create tones in a certain harmonic sequence where you could be missing the fundamental, and your brain will try to put that fundamental back in instead of actually having to build the pipe. That goes into a lot of weird psychoacoustic things that I probably shouldn't say more about because it's not my area, so I'm just repeating some things some other people have heard. Anyway, so let's use Euler's formula on this and try to break up this cosine and the sine into complex exponentials. So I'll write this as 4 divided by 2 e to the j 10 pi t plus 2 e to the minus j 10 pi t. And remember from Euler's formula, this gives you a cosine real part and a sine imaginary part. Similarly here, the cosines combine together to give us this 4 cosine, the real parts, but the imaginary parts, the sine that comes from this part has a minus, so the sines cancel. And then we get just the real part left with the cosine. Now, in terms of how to handle this sine, there is Euler's formula for sine, but I found that tends to be a little more error prone. You have to remember where the j is in the denominator. You have to get the minus signs right. I quite often find it's easier just to say, take this whole thing and rewrite it as 2 cosine 15 pi t minus pi over 2, standard trig identity. And you don't have to do this. You know, several roads will lead you to the same destination. But I found making this kind of change tends to be a little less error prone than directly using the Euler's formula for sine. The other thing you quite often want to do is if you see a minus in front of here, I usually recommend, let's say down here, if you have a minus cosine in this expression, minus whatever it is. It's usually better to take that minus sign and use a trig identity. This is whatever it is. And here we'll do either plus or minus pi, whatever is more convenient. Again, to put this into a sort of a phase term in here and not have to worry about the minus sign later. That tends to be less error prone, but your mileage may vary. Anyway, so let's go ahead and apply this. So using Euler's formula, we divide this 2 by 2, which will just give us a 1. So this would be like e to the j 15 pi t plus e to the minus j 15 pi t. And now that we've written in this form, we see that essentially the Fourier series has basically been spelled out for us. So the Fourier series in general, let me go back to my pen tool here. The Fourier series in its most general form was this sum over k, ak, e to the j, omega naught kt. The omega naught here, that's clearly, again, that's 5 pi radians per second, or whatever your time unit is. But this expression we have here is already in this form. You can read off the Fourier series coefficients. So in this case, we'll read off this 2. That's going to be a2. Again, there is no a1 in this expression. If I take 5 pi multiplied by 2, that gives me the 10. This 2 here, that would then be my a minus 2. Here, my Fourier series coefficient is just this kind of 1 that was sitting out in front in terms of a3, the third one. Same thing over here. This would be your a minus 3. When you write what the Fourier series coefficients are, remember they're just these phasor type terms sitting out in front. In general, this could be complex. You don't want to ever write something like a2 equals 2 e to the j 10 pi t. It does not include all of this actual complex sinusoidal sort of stuff. So if you have terms in your expression, let me do a different one. Let's call it yt, just to have something else. If it's something like 3 cosine 10 pi t, say plus pi over 3, with some practice, you can sort of start skipping this step. So here, there's only one cosine in here, so this is very trivially, in this case, has an omega naught of 10 pi, just a single cosine. What are the Fourier series coefficients? Well, you take this, multiply it by 2, but now remember I have to include the phase term here. The positive Fourier series coefficient, I'll grab what the phase term for the cosine is. This is e to the j pi over 3. And for this particular example, well, you know what, actually this is for y, so I probably shouldn't use a again. Let me say this is b. I will say this is b1. And then b2 is going to, in this case, be the complex conjugate term. And just with some practice, you can go back and forth like this without having to explicitly spell out the steps. Sorry, this is not b minus 2. This is b minus 1. It's the conjugate term that I'm looking for. So we'll say b minus 1. This is equal to 3/2 e to the minus j pi over 3. There's this conjugate sort of symmetry going on. So that's convenient if the Fourier series you're looking at, or the x of t you're trying to compute the Fourier series for, is already written as a sum of sinusoids. So next time we'll look at the Fourier series analysis integral. We'll review that to talk about what you do if you have something more complicated. See you soon.